You're listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today our guest is
Teresa Bixby.
Teresa, can you tell everybody what your role is at the university?
I am a professor in the chemistry department, but I'm also the assessment director for the university, and pretty soon I'm going to be moving into the provost office for that role.
Awesome. Well, it's the beginning of the semester, and at a recent college meeting, we were talking about how students have been impacted by the pandemic. And so there's a discussion about whether the learning styles of students have changed, whether students have changed, and whether we actually, as educators, need to be doing things differently. And this podcast was, in some sense, inspired because Dr. Bixby came up to me afterwards and basically said, you know, Chris, just because there's been a pandemic, cognitive science hasn't changed. And there's been decades and decades of research about how students learn, and we have to remember and follow the science. And
which we're supposed to do as scientists, I hear.
I know. Sometimes it's hard, though. So, Dr. Bixby, I was wondering if you could just start us off with a little bit of the research that you've been doing, looking into these cognitive theories about learning.
Sure. Mostly just as a practitioner. As somebody, I feel like I have to disclaim this for anybody who's listening out there. STEM faculty, by and large, were not trained to teach. So we teach the way we were taught, and that doesn't necessarily follow cognitive science. So the people we were serving when we teach the way we have been taught is a certain subset of people. But there's a lot of evidence since the 1950s about how people learn, and it's incumbent upon us as faculty to go and find that professional development, to learn how to teach, essentially, and we learn from each other. We learn by trial.
And error.
Trial and error, yes. But I think that because of the pandemic, the ways in which students have changed has just exacerbated the gap between how we teach and how people learn.
Oh, so one of the suggestions then is that we weren't optimized in the way we were delivering education before the pandemic. So then with maybe I'll use the word trauma associated with the pandemic, it just made it more obvious that we weren't paying attention to what cognitive science was telling us in the first place as to how best to educate students.
I think that's true. Yeah. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's a limited subset of people who learn best by being spoken to and having words written on a board or a PowerPoint.
So okay, can I ask something else? I know that in the classroom observation form that we have here at Lewis University, there's a category called, did the faculty member address the various learning styles that students have? But I have many people telling me that, well, including people from the education college, saying that it's not obvious that there actually are distinct learning styles in that, I learn best orally. I need to listen to what somebody says in order for me to learn. Or I can only learn if I read something. Or I'm a visual learner. I can only learn if I am looking at an image. Have you looked into this?
Yeah. So in that way, the idea that each individual student has a preferred way of learning everything, that is false. That is patently false. It has been proved false multiple times in the literature. But what they're finding is true is that some content is best addressed in different styles. And so, in chemistry, there's this thing called Johnstone's triangle, where there's 3 different representations of what's happening. There's the macroscopic, I have a solution in a beaker representation. There's a particulate level representation where you draw a molecule as like sticks and balls. And then there's a symbolic representation that's like CH4 when we write chemical formula. And those 3 things need to be tied together. And if you don't present information connected, then there's a lot more misconceptions about each one of those things. So making the connection between the symbolic and the microscopic, particulate level is really, really important when teaching students how to do, say, stoichiometry. And so you need both of those things. But there are other things that you might learn best by reading or talking about or through analyzing a text. But that doesn't mean that everything that student learns is best done in text.
So it's not person specific, it's
Content specific.
content. Yeah, and that makes total sense. It would be like telling a person to learn choreography from reading, which is probably not the most efficient way.
That might be my preferred way of learning how to do it. I don't want anyone looking at me. Don't look at me while I'm trying to learn how to do this.
Yeah, because that should be kinesthetic and probably visual.
Right.
But,
And learners do have preferences, but again, regardless of their preferences, some content is best learned in certain ways.
yeah, so probably when you're thinking about science and STEM, it's maybe not as obvious to people as when you do give an example like dance.
Yeah.
Where you're like, of course I wouldn't want to just read what the steps to the foxtrot. I don't even know how to do the foxtrot. Like, what that is. But yeah, because it's probably a misconception of mine, but as a teacher, I try to hit on the different learning styles, but not... I don't know. I guess I've always thought it sort of as like trying to find all the different learners, but maybe I'm just trying to take one. I'm just going to pretend now that I'm taking one content material and approaching it from different ways.
One of the things that people have said about my teaching style, and then it translates into my home life, is that I'll repeat something in various ways.
Right.
And so I'll present it in a particular framing, and then I'll immediately shift and present the same idea with a different framing in a different context in hope of helping a listener or learner see it and have that aha moment, because so much of what we're trying to do in science is to get the student, the learner, to go, oh, okay, yeah, now I see what you're trying to say.
Right.
Yeah, so the knowledge has to be connected to prior knowledge in their brain, and no individual has the same set of prior knowledge or prior experiences. And so saying things in multiple different ways helps you hit the bases where students might have it might hit something in their brain that they already have prior knowledge for. So I think that's a really good strategy.
Can I share one silly story associated with that?
Of course.
I was teaching an introductory physics course for architecture students at Illinois Tech, and I was talking about fluid dynamics. And so I brought up this notion of how toilets actually work, and how it's a siphon. And there's a siphon effect that clears out the bowl. And so I was trying to get them to understand what a siphon was. And there is a student from Turkey, and she just lit up. And she goes, do you know what the word for toilet is in Turkish? It's siphon.
Oh, wow.
And
I did not know
like,
that.
oh, there you go. And that might be an example of touching on different past knowledge, information that's already in somebody's brain, and you're making a connection so that they can better comprehend and then internalize it.
Yeah. And it's also a really good strategy. I used to use this in general chemistry a lot, is to an assignment is to have students find connections between what we're talking about in the real world in their real life. So they have to search their brain and search their experience to find the connection. And make analogies so that they can build that structure in their own brain. I tell my students all the time, like, I already know this. It's connected to weird knowledge in my head that you don't have. You have to make your own connections. Otherwise, it's not going to stick.
So I hear constantly teachers, my brother's a fifth grade teacher, and I know many other people who are, K through 12 teachers, and they say students are different today. And, the collegiate educators that I'm familiar with and here at Lewis University and elsewhere say the same thing. And in some sense, there's a little bit of frustration, and students are different today. So with the understanding that cognitive science on how to teach isn't any different as a consequence of a virus, what do you think people are saying when classroom instructors are basically throwing up their hands and saying, I'm confused because what I used to do doesn't seem to be working anymore?
So I think the two things that really stick out to me are that learning is a social endeavor, and we make it an individual endeavor. And that works for some individuals, especially if they don't have other traumas or other stuff going on. But one thing we don't do a good job of is making learning social. So that's one thing I feel like we need to be better about doing. So there's a lot of pedagogies that deal with team learning or project-based learning or those types of things. I think those are really great. moving towards making learning social. The other thing that's really important is that learning is emotional. Like, emotions really impact learning. I'm sure you've all had a student who's like over the top anxious and like cannot get through a test because they're just so anxious and they bomb.
Right.
But it's not because they don't know the content. It's because their anxiety has gotten the better of them and it turns their brain off. So I think the students, whatever the experience of the pandemic had, was to make us more isolated and to make us on high alert. Like, the students are much more anxious. They have a lot more trauma. There's a lot more going on in their lives. And the way we teach does not account for that. So building community, building belonging, and understanding that learning is a social endeavor. It is not an individual endeavor often. It's just not the best way for us to learn. I think we need to move away from those things. And that's really entrenched in our educational system, is to say, you're responsible for you. How much time did you put into studying your content? And that's it. You do have to make those personal connections, but the best way to do that is in community with other people.
And as it was pointed out at our college meeting as well, this generation's the loneliest generation.
Yeah, and that's just really surprising. And it's intriguing to me because they say that's the most connected generation, in that they have access to people on the other side of the planet at a moment's notice, yet it isn't satisfying some need that is inside, and it's generating loneliness. So apparently communication is insufficient to address loneliness. There needs to be a deeper connection. There needs to be a deeper bond that's created in order to satisfy that part of our humanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also can speak from experience from the pandemic. Video chatting and Zooming with friends, not nearly the same as being in a room with them and being able to like communicate and connect that way. So it's still lonely even when you can see people that you actually know on video versus coming together physically.
Well, that makes me think that there's so much more to communication than words.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And how important it is, because I know that my daughter, one of the things that she said when she went away to college is that when she was in high school, she had very close relationships with people, and they would hug each other like on a daily basis before school started. And then she went away to college, and she didn't have that physical touch with the people she went to school with, and it impacted her severely enough that she was actually commenting and talking about it to her parents, to me and my wife, and how much she missed that aspect of school. And it impacted her ability to actually learn, because she didn't feel as if her needs, and she was being distracted by the fact that, wait a minute, I haven't hugged anybody today. And it was intriguing for me to think about that.
Yeah, I think all of that's incredibly important in order to be connected and supported. Like, the way you're going to learn best is if you're healthy and happy apart from that and have the energy to invest in learning. And so we have to consider those things as well.
So creating an environment, a space. So maybe what I'm taking away from this, and please let me know what you think, is one of the most important things that I can do as an educator is to create a space where people feel welcomed, they feel included, they feel comfortable, and low anxiety. As almost like a foundation. And what am I missing, Teresa? What else do I need?
Well, if anybody wants to read more about that philosophy or that pedagogy, you can look up pedagogy of care.
Oh.
So if you Google pedagogy of care, that's what that's all about.
And it's about creating a foundational environment in which then students are more able. It's the same thing as like if they're hungry, right? If they, that's why school breakfast programs are so important in certain communities, because if a child is hungry, how are they going to be able to learn?
Mm-hmm.
And going back just to touch on more to communication than words, how many times do you get a text message from someone and you're confused about what they're actually saying or their connotation because it's just words, and without those visual cues of facial expressions, you're like, are they being sarcastic? Are they being serious? Did I completely misinterpret this? So, yeah.
I got that from a photograph. Somebody sent me a photograph the other day, and I completely misunderstood what they were trying to tell me. And I was almost having a panic attack, and then I reached out to them, and they were like laughing when I got them on the phone, because I was like, call me now. And so they called me, and it was like, oh, I was trying to share a joke with you.
And you're like, something is terribly wrong.
And it was completely lost in translation. Any final words that you'd like to share about this topic? Something that we didn't ask yet?
Or a way that we can all get better. One small thing we can do.
Ooh. Well, I think we're going to talk later about grades, so I'm not going to start that. I'm not going to open that can of worms yet. No, I think, letting students know that you care about them is just a really great thing to start doing.
And just so students do know, if any students are listening, we do actually care. It's not just a trick to make you learn. We actually care.
But saying it and providing evidence of that are two different things.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So.
Excellent.
I'm open for hugs, maybe.
Depends on who.
Well, you've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And our guest today, Teresa Bixby. And, I have to read the disclaimer. That's what I was looking for.
I was getting worried.
So the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. Thanks.
See you next time.